So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome very much to our seminar this evening. It's wonderful that people could join us online as well as coming to the Institute. As you see, we're still experimenting with these formats. I thank you for your patience as we sorted out the technical complications. So, my name is David Shangeland. I'm the chairman of the Society, and we are organising several events in the next few weeks. I strongly encourage you to look at the website. They're all absolutely fascinating, and we look forward to seeing people at them. But this evening, we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Doga Ozturk, who will be speaking about Fatma Aliye, specifically setting the record straight, Fatma against Orientalist portrayals of women in the Islamic societies. So, welcome to our group, and we look forward to your.
Thank you. Thank you very much for hosting me as a speaker at the Anglo-Turkish Society, especially you, Craig, and you, David, and giving me the opportunity to share a part of my research with you. So, as David said, I'm going to be talking to you about a pioneering Ottoman female intellectual, Fatma Aliye, who is known as the first female Ottoman, first female novelist of the Ottoman Empire. To be more specific, I will look at how Fatma Aliye responded to the Orientalist portrayals of Muslim women in the late 19th century, or in 19th century in general. These portrayals were by Europeans, obviously, and I will do this mainly by focusing two main works of hers. This one, Islam, and which can be translated as Women of Islam, and a lesser known work called Namdaran Zenan Islamiyan, which can be translated as Famous Women of Islam or Famous Muslim Women. I will mainly demonstrate that Fatma Aliye was very much aware of how Europeans, 19th century Europeans, portrayed Muslims in general and Muslim women. For her to actually resist and offer a counter-narrative to these discourses. I also want to explore, however, in the talk, how Fatma Aliye approached this topic and what kind of strategies that she used while doing so. I will show that although she was offering a counter-narrative to attempt to correct these Orientalist representations of Muslim women, her own version of Islam actually, or Islamic history, emerged from Orientalist discourses, Orientalist principles itself. So in fact, she never actually questions in her work the main principles of Orientalism, but instead, she kind of demonstrates, or she tries to domesticate and familiarize the Orient for the European audience. So to put it into context, I will begin with giving you a little bit background information on the 19th century Ottoman Empire and the reforms that the Ottomans experienced at that time, which led to a number of significant shifts for women in Ottoman society. This context will help us basically better understand how Fatma Aliye became who she was and how she became a pioneer intellectual in the late 19th century Ottoman Empire. After this background, I will talk about Fatma Aliye's efforts to counter the Orientalist discourses, and which will be the main part of the lecture. I will, as I said, give examples from this one, Islam, and I may say this one for short, and Namdaran, again for short, for Namdaran Zenan Islamiyan, to show how she worked to present a different picture of Islam and Muslim women than was portrayed by the Europeans at the time. And in the end, I will just briefly explore why these works are important, why Fatma Aliye's efforts were actually important, and what they tell us more broadly about the efforts of post-colonial intellectuals to break free of these frameworks that Western thought put them in, and to what extent they were successful or not. So a little background on the 19th century Ottoman Empire. As some of you may know, this was a period of westernizing reforms for the Ottomans. It is a very huge topic, so I won't go into a lot of detail in here, but I will mainly focus on the reforms in the education system, which had significant repercussions for Ottoman women. So Ottoman sultans, beginning with Selim III, who reigned between 1789 and 1807, and Mahmud II, reigned between 1808 and 1839. Started these from this period on, these sultans and the bureaucracy started to establish a number of schools based on European models to be able to train basically personnel for rapidly expanding military and imperial bureaucracy. What initially began this way, though, like as a way to train these personnel for the empire, soon gradually turned into a wider project of educating the population, educating the masses. As a result, a new body of government schools started to be established throughout the empire from the 1830s onwards. And this actually to a couple of important changes that I want to emphasize. One was the rapid rise in literacy rates among the population. This in turn resulted in the establishment or the gradual emergence of a reading public, which can be labeled as Ottoman print capitalism, if you want. And as a result, a number of journals and newspapers started to be established in the empire, especially in Istanbul and urban centers. And Ottoman intellectuals actually started to produce works in quote-unquote new genres like novels and plays. So, and the Ottoman people who were educated or who went to these schools started to actually also be gradually exposed to ideas such as liberty, constitutionalism, progress, etc. And this happened also mainly through European literature as well. More importantly, for our purposes, though, these new schools were not only targeting men. They also targeted women as well, although to a lesser degree. So in 1859, schools for first Ottoman schools for girls started to be established, and they were followed by schools for women in 1870. As a result, literacy rates for women also increased a lot, and which again led to the establishment of a number of magazines specifically targeting women. So in a sense, we can say that a female reading public also came into being at this time. We must understand, though, and I cannot overemphasize this enough, Ottoman women were not simply consumers of these journals, but they were also their producers. An increasing number of women, especially women from elite backgrounds, came to write in these journals, first under pen names, and then later on with their own names. And the main reason why they used first pen names, it was the fact that it was thought to be socially unacceptable for women to quote unquote appear in public with their own names. So that's why they use pen names. This actually gradually changed, and Fatma, as I will talk about, was one of the pioneers of this. And by the late 19th century, more and more women came to break out of these gender norms and use their own names while they were signing their intellectual products. And this kind of brings me to Fatma Aliye, the main protagonist of this talk. She was very much, we can say, as a product of her time. She was coming from a very elite background, and her father was Ahmet Cevdet Pasha, the famous Ottoman historian and statesman and intellectual. Fatma Aliye was born in Istanbul in 1862 and grew up in a very large house and prosperous household, which also included private tutors for Ahmet Cevdet Pasha's children. This background, though, even though it sounds like very prestigious, also meant that her own life was controlled or regulated by the gender norms of the time. To give you one example, even though she displayed a lot of interest in learning when she was a little girl, Fatma Aliye could only start her formal education by listening to the private classes that her brother Ali Sedat was taking in the mansion in the house. Later, as her interest and her talent became more obvious, especially to her father, private tutors were assigned to her as well. Another example, when she wanted to learn French, at the age of 10, she knew that she had to convince her father, because at that time, French was not considered to be a very suitable subject for Muslim girls to study. Luckily for her, Ahmet Cevdet Pasha agreed with her wishes, and by the time she was 13, she was proficient in, or she had an excellent grasp of French, Arabic, and Persian, as well as Ottoman Turkish. Another important milestone in her life came when she was 17, when her family decided to marry her to Faik Bey and later Pasha, who was an aide-de-camp at the palace at the Sultan's court. Let's just say she was not very pleased with the decision, but thought of it as her duty to comply with her family's wishes. But it was very obvious from the very start that they were not compatible. So Fatma Aliye and Faik Bey were not compatible. And there were two main reasons for this. One, Fatma Aliye was much better and much more educated than Faik Bey. And two, Faik Bey was opposed to Fatma Aliye's literary pursuits, mainly because she was a woman. Later in life, though, they managed a compromise among each other, between themselves, to the point that Faik Bey started to help her copy her manuscripts. I should also mention that while she was married, she continued her lessons with her father, Ahmet Cevdet Pasha, and taking classes from him on Islamic law, Islamic history, and etc. And there's a third figure who played a very significant role, a male figure in her life, in her literary career. And the third one was this Ottoman intellectual Ahmet Mithat Efendi. Ahmet Mithat was a friend of Ahmet Cevdet Pasha. So when he noticed that Fatma Aliye had this talent for literature, he took her under his wings. In fact, her very first published work, like Fatma Aliye's very first published work, was a translation from French, which appeared in Ahmet Mithat's journal Tercüman Hakikat. Again, as I said before, at this time she did not use her own name with the translation, but signed it simply as a woman. And in the press of the time, you can see these debates going on of whether a woman can actually know French that well to be able to translate like a piece from French into Ottoman language. Between 1891 and 1910, she published 5 novels and a number of other works under her own name this time. And in these works, especially in her novels, she examined the transformation that the Ottoman Empire or Ottoman society was going through at the time, especially when it came to domestic life, which was transitioning from being based on these large households to more like a nuclear family kind families, basically. Even though she lived until 1936, Fatma Aliye actually wrote less and less after 1910, and largely disappeared from public life in the early Turkish Republic. I think this is mainly because her worldview and the way she advocated for women's rights did not actually sit quite well with the leaders of the early Turkish Republic. I will explain what I mean by this in a minute. Recently, though, in a couple of, maybe 10, 12 years, she had like a second life in Turkey. And one fun fact is, for those of you who don't know, her face is on the 50 lira Turkish bill. So if you look at it, you can see her face there. Going back to her literary life after this brief detour, like her contemporaries, she examined a number of topics especially in her novels, such as family, gender relationships, domestic slavery, poverty in Ottoman society. What made her works unique, though, is that she examined these topics through the perspective of women. Especially in her novels, she granted her women characters a lot of agency, and she insisted on the necessity for women to have financial independence. And you can see these in her novels repeatedly. And this was a very radical idea at the time. Overall, we can say, I think, that her earlier experiences with gender relations in Ottoman society and patriarchy, and here we can think of her relationship with these 3 figures, like her father, her husband, and Ahmet Mithat, kind of actually shaped and informed her works later in life. She also contributed a great deal and frequently to women's magazines in Istanbul, writing about women's status in Ottoman society. We must not think of her, though, as like a radical feminist. as we will understand the concept today, because her advocacy for women kind of stemmed from an Islamic reforms perspective. And what I mean by this is that she made frequent references, as we will see in the talk, to Islamic history or Islamic civilization to demonstrate that Islam was actually not an impediment to women's social progress. And I think this perspective of trying to bring together Islam and women's rights was the main reason why the early Turkish Republic leaders did not approve of her that much. So she kind of withdrew upon herself, and she didn't make like a lot of public appearances or like didn't write anymore. I think these efforts also correspond to her efforts to respond to Orientalist discourses, which brings me to the main part of my analysis, basically. So to explain what I mean, I will basically use two of her works, as I said. One is the more famous one, this one Islam. This is actually one of her most famous works. It was published in 1892. This work consists of three long dialogues that Fatma Aliye claimed she had with European women travelers who came to Istanbul and who visited her in her house. In the introduction, actually, she says that she decided to write this work because when she realized how ignorant these European elite women were of Islam or Muslim women. The work was serialized in Ahmet Cevdet's Tercüman Hakikat and was later compiled into a book. Interestingly, after it was published, it was translated into French, Arabic, and English. And in fact, it was displayed at the Chicago World Fair in 1893 and won a prize there. And the second work that I want to talk about is Namdaran Zaman Islamiyan, famous Muslim woman. This was a lesser known work. Actually, this was what kind of started me. This was what actually led me to go into this topic. When I came across this work, I was like, okay, I need to, because when I checked, no one or almost no one wrote anything about it. So I wanted to analyze it and, put it in the framework of like Orientalism, etc. Namdaran was actually a biographical dictionary, which had a very important place in Islamic literary arts. So basically what that means is that she takes and compiles these biographies of famous Muslim women, starting from very early Islamic history and ending with the Ottoman times. She again wrote this work, unlike Niswan Islam, she wrote this work for a very international audience. It was to be displayed at the Paris World Exhibition that was organized in 1900. In her introduction, she states that she decided to compose this piece as a result of all these requests coming from her, from these foreign ladies who asked her to pen this work for the exhibition. Obviously, she had a lot of connections with a lot of women in both, mostly United States, but also mostly in Europe, but some in United States as well. Even though the book was initially, planned to be published in French only, she decided to also issue it in Ottoman Turkish, and as a result, it was serialized in an Istanbul weekly called Malumat between 16th of June 1999 and 19th of July 1900. This is the very first page, so this is the start of it, and then this is the very first time that it appeared in Malumat. And in this work, she wanted to demonstrate was that to put the blame for the state of Muslim women of her time to Islam or Turkishness was an unjust assessment. Here we need to also realize that she kind of realizes that women's status is not, as great or as it should be, let's say. So that was the problem with women's status for her, but she did not find fault with Islam or Turkishness for this. So in these two works, she talks about a number of different themes, but I will focus on two main ones for this talk, which are polygamy and gender segregation, with a particular focus on the very famous topic and concept of harem, basically. So I'll start with polygamy. So Oriental scholars or European scholars who studied Islam knew actually that Islamic law actually permitted Muslim men to marry up to 4 women. For the 19th century Europeans who adhered to the Victorian principles or morality, ideals of morality, though, this was simply unacceptable. For them, polygamy was not only an aberration, but it was the main reason, or one of the main reasons, for the social quote-unquote decay that they allegedly witnessed in Muslim countries. So in a sense, they tried and they basically equated polygamous family structures that they believe to be common norm in that Muslim societies with the backwardness of the Muslim lands. This is an image by Delacroix. It's titled "Women of Algiers" in their apartment. So you see these like women just hanging out, and then if you look at on the right, there's the black harem master or chief eunuch who basically controlled the harems and who made sure that the genders are not mixed, basically. So yeah. As you can guess, these Orientalist discourses on polygamy did not actually correspond with the reality on the ground. The practice of polygamy was actually declining in Ottoman society in the late 19th century, especially among the newly emerging middle classes. The ideal monogamous relationship based on love and companionship gradually became the standard for establishing a family. In fact, according to one calculation made by my advisor, Carter Finley, by 1897, only 3% of Istanbul men were in a polygamous marriage. Naturally, Fatma Aliye was very much aware that monogamy was gradually becoming the standard in familial relationships in Ottoman society. She also knew, however, that Europeans still believed polygamy to be the norm in Ottoman society. Which is why she took up this theme in Namdaran and Niswan Islam. In both of these works, she addresses the issue openly. First, she presents it as an improvement, polygamy as an improvement that advanced women's status in society. She argues that before Islam, Arab men could take as many wives as they wished, but Islam limited this number to 4. She also argued, however, that Islamic law made it so strict for them that it became almost an impossibility, like polygamy or polygamous marriages almost became an impossibility. Interestingly, she also reminded her readers that Islam did not disregard the possibility that with the advancement of civilization, quote unquote, this principle could be altered as well. I should mention that her works make it very clear that her own choice or own preference was with monogamy. She makes the point very obvious in the second dialogue of Niswan Islam, where she repeatedly praises the monogamous relationship as the better form. She also tries to establish the idea, mainly in Namdaran, that monogamy was actually not a novelty for the 19th century Muslims. Instead, she kind of presents this picture where it was historically common and commendable practice within the Muslim societies, even from the very early on. So to give you an example, in her biography of Khadija, Prophet Muhammad's first wife, she emphasizes, underlines the fact that Prophet Muhammad neither married nor took any concubines, even though it was permitted for him, as long as Khadija was alive. A similar situation was also true for Ali, who went on to become the 4th caliph after Muhammad died. And according to the version that Fatma presents in Namdaran, Ali married, we know this for fact, Ali married Prophet Muhammad's wife, Prophet Muhammad's daughter, Fatima. But according to the version that Fatma presents in this work, even though prominent members of early Muslim society offered their daughters to Ali as like additional wives. He refused to marry anyone else as long as Fatima was alive. So Fatma Aliye claims that this shows how Fatima lived with Ali until the end of her days without having any quote-unquote partners in marriage. So with these examples and in both of these works, what she was trying to do, what Fatma Aliye was trying to do, was to refute the Orientalist trope that polygamy was and has always been a norm or like the principle in Islamic history. She responds back to these Orientalist constructs by constructing a counter reality where polygamy was not a like inherent practice in Islam, but monogamy was also a common and preferable practice in Muslim society, basically. The second theme that I want to speak about is and she addresses in this also in both Niswan Islam and Namdaran, is the practice of gender segregation in Muslim societies, or to be more specific, life in the harem. So what was the harem? I mean, to give you a very simple definition, harem was simply the private quarters of a Muslim home, where female members of the household also resided. Entrance to the harem was forbidden for any other adult male who was not a relative of the women living there. In the imagination of the Orientalists, however, of the 19th century, harem became the secretive and forbidden place where Muslim men subjugated helpless women to all kinds of like cruelty and sexual debauchery. Harem also came to be seen as the main symbol of Oriental despotism and cruelty. So in a sense, the Europeans used this image, the idea of the harem, as like a tool to construct the Orient as Europe's inferior other. This is another picture by Delacroix. It's called The Death of Sardanapalus. So admittedly, this is not a painting strictly depicting the harem, but I chose this because it shows, I think it shows beautifully what the Europeans would actually imagine harem to be. I mean, like naked women, killing going on, and with this like men lying around there. So that's why I chose this painting. Of course, there was resistance actually to this picture painted by the Europeans. One of the first interventions to this idea of the harem life came from actually European women themselves. These women travelers visited the Ottoman lands from the 18th century onwards and wrote about their experiences for the European reading public. I must say, or we must notice that contrary, as opposed to the male travelers, these women, European women, could actually enter the harems of Muslim households in the places where they visited and actually see what was going on. So as a result, starting with the appearance of Lady Montagu's Turkish embassy letters, which was published in 1763, increasing number of European female travelers began to write on what they saw in the harems. This genre came to be called the harem literature, and it became especially popular after the 19th century, from mid-19th century onwards, when travel to Orient became much more easier and safer for European women. Again, like as opposed to their male counterparts of the time, these European women depicted the harems as more as a desexualized and domesticated space, to use Raina Lewis's description. And they offered this counter-narrative to the dominant Orientalist tropes of the time. I must mention, though, that this does not mean that these accounts were uniform or exempt from like political or cultural biases of the time, nor were they free of like sexual or fantastical details. Despite these weaknesses, though, these works by European women actually tried to shift the dominant narrative on the harem and present it as like a more Ottoman or Muslim domesticity. I mean, more importantly for our purposes, the Ottoman women themselves also kind of pushed back against the Orientalist representations of their own lives. By the end of the 19th century, Ottoman women were actually fed up with being objects of like scrutiny by the Europeans to continue to intrude into their domestic space and observe them as if they were from like a different species. So they kind of took it upon their own hands, and these Ottoman women, especially women from elite backgrounds at this time, started to write their own versions of what harem was, and offered these to the Western literary public. I must say that this was actually rather a bold move at the time, because it led them to defy the cultural norms, which kind of forbade Muslim women from exposing their private lives to strangers. I should also say that even though these women, I mean, kind of resisted the Orientalist portrayals, and they presented the harem more of a domestic space, they could not fully resist the temptation to use some of the Orientalist stereotypes themselves. Mainly because they want to sell more books, and they wanted to establish this like distinct identity as quote-unquote Orientals in the eyes of the Western readers. So these two books by Fatma Aliye should be seen within this context, basically. Her works, however, differ from the others in one key respect for me, especially in Namdaran. Rather than writing about her own experience of the harem, Fatma Aliye historicized the harem and as an institution, and narrates its evolution through Islamic history. And when she does this, she challenges the Orientalist idea of quote-unquote timelessness of the Orient, and puts the practice of gender segregation in Islam within its historical context. One thing she tries to do, again, is to shatter the assumption, like she did with polygamy, that gender segregation was actually an inherent practice in Muslim societies. Instead, through the historical examples that she gives, she argues that mixing of men and women were actually common and normal in Arabia in the early Islamic period. For instance, in her biography, or in her version of the biography of a Muslim, early Muslim woman called Sulaim, she was one of the earliest Muslim converts. She tries to show that in the formative years of Islam, it was common for men and women to meet before marriage, and this practice was not considered shameful. So according to Fatma Aliye's version, it was simply normal for Sulaim's suitor to meet with her and talk with her before marrying her. Fatma Aliye here, supports these arguments with the hadith, which is a saying by the Prophet Muhammad, who allegedly said that it was better for men to meet their prospective wives before marrying them. And to give a final example, later in the work, Fatma Aliye emphasizes that in Islam's early years, male and female poets could meet in gatherings where they recited poetry together. For her, this again showed that mixing of genders at this time was just considered normal. She does a similar thing in Niswan Islam as well, where she argues that gender segregation practiced in Muslim societies was not actually a result of religious principles, but was the result, or was caused by tradition or established practice. In Niswan Islam, again, she goes back to the Prophet Muhammad's time and recounts the story of Aisha, Prophet Muhammad's second wife, who Muhammad married after Khadija died. So according to tradition, Islamic tradition, Aisha was very knowledgeable about Islam and Islamic principles. And so Fatma Aliye actually goes to say that Muslim men of this at this time came to Aisha's house and could ask her questions personally, face to face, about matters of religion, about Islam. Again, she gives it as an example of how like gender segregation was not just there from the very beginning of Islamic society. So how then did gender segregation and the harems become more and more established practice? Fatma Aliye explains that the roots of this tradition as well in Namdaran. She locates the emergence of the harems in the Abbasid period in the 8th century, which was a period of wealth and prosperity. And for Fatma Aliye, one way for Muslim men or Muslim elite to display this wealth was to construct these big houses or mansions, especially in urban centers. So gradually over time, these great houses or mansions came to have special quarters called the harem for elite women to rest and spend their times with in privacy. And for her, this was the emergence, how the harems, the idea of the harem emerged actually. She also reminds her readers that harems were not unique to Islamic society. And she makes a comparison between the early Muslim societies and their counterparts in ancient Greek and Iranian civilizations. So in a sense, she implies that gender segregation was practiced in these civilizations or in the societies as well. So it was not unique for the Muslims. More significantly, she draws a parallel between the harems of Muslim homes and the private chambers of the European ladies of her time. You must remember that this book and this one, Islam, was written and published for a European audience. So with this, she wanted to show how harem was basically a regular domestic space, and actually describe it in terms that her European reading public would understand and be familiar with. So this kind of gives me a good segue into the strategies that she used, which is the final point that I want to make or analyze. So basically the strategies that she used while narrate or offering her counter narrative to these Orientalist discourses. I mean, we can easily make the case that these refutations or these responses that Fatma Aliye offers in her works were not accurate in a historical sense. I would argue, however, that how real or how historically accurate her examples were may be actually the wrong question to pose. Instead, we must focus on what she was trying to do, and what she was trying to do was to translate, quote unquote, and domesticate the Orient for her European audience and making it legible for them, like for the Europeans. Doing so, though, kind of blinds her, and she never actually truly questions the basic assumptions which Orientalism itself was based on and which she was trying to respond. And this basic principle was the idea that East, quote unquote, and West, again in quotes, are separate and different entities. In this sense, I would argue she continues to operate within the framework of Orientalism. And I mean, I already gave a couple of examples, but I will talk about a few more to illustrate my point a little bit better. Before I do that, though, I will go into theory a little bit. I'll try to keep it short, don't worry. So scholars such as Michel Foucault, Judith Butler, Edward Said, here we see the cover of his famous book, and Habib Abba, they established the fact that resistance to a discourse actually emerges from the discourse itself. These thinkers argued actually that discourses, even though they are very strong, they are never totally hegemonic. And there are always cracks in them, which makes resistance to them possible. So in that sense, it's not surprising to see Fatma Aliye's counter-narratives to these discourses, to Orientalism, emerges from within the framework of Orientalism itself. This is the end of theory. So throughout Niswan, Islam, and Namdaran, she, as I said, accepts, even though implicitly accepts, the fact that the East is essentially, in an essential manner, different and distinct from the West, which, as I said, it was one of the key principles of Orientalism. In fact, her effort in these works are geared toward proving that this difference was not as great as the Oriental scholars presented to be. So to put it differently, she was trying to familiarize and domesticate the Orient for a Western audience who perceived it as different and Europe's inferior other. One example of how she does this is, again, discussing the topic. I talked about this while discussing the topic of harem in Namdaran. As I said before, while narrating the emergence of the harems in Abbasid period, she compares them to the private chambers of European ladies from elite social backgrounds. Here, I would argue that what she's trying to do is to depict the harem life as a very normal thing by presenting it as a practice which had a counterpart in the late 19th century European society. It is very obvious that the 19th century European ladies who reading these texts or being exposed to these texts would immediately understand what Fatma Aliye was referring to with this comparison that she was making. It's almost as if she's saying, look, our own lifestyles are as normal as yours are. To give you a final example, again in Namdaran, discussing the life of Miri Hanım, who was a very famous Ottoman female poet after the 16th century. Fatma Aliye argued that her residence, Miri Hanım's residence, at this time was a popular gathering place for the prominent literary and intellectual figures of the time, both male and female. This description to me, when I first read it, sounded very similar to the literary salons of Europe, which the European ladies kept and which was a very popular practice in the late 19th century. In fact, Fatma Aliye's version of Miri Hanım could easily take her place among the European women who basically hosted these intellectuals of the time in their salons. So again, she's trying to say, look, it's not very different. We're not very different. We're not as different as you present it to be. So I will conclude by briefly talking about why Fatma Aliye and her efforts were actually important. So first off, these texts by Fatma Aliye show how Ottoman female writers could and did resist the Orientalist narratives about Muslim women, even at a very international arena. They were not simply passive recipients of this discourse or of Orientalist representations of Muslim women. They were actually active participants in this, admittedly lopsided dialogue between Europeans and the Muslim world. A specific point I want to make about Namdaran and why it is important is it is important to note that Fatma Aliye used a very traditional Islamic literary form, a biographical dictionary, to speak back to the Orientalist discourse. I think for me this makes it very interesting. So she didn't use like a novel or a play, but she used a very Islamic literary form to respond back to the Orientalist discourses. As we have seen, she was using a modern version of this popular Islamic literary genre and to respond or to correct the Orientalist myths, as well as advancing the cause of Muslim women, again, in an international arena. The final point I want to make and why it is important is that while resisting these Orientalist narratives, it's very obvious that Ottoman intellectuals of the late 19th and even early 20th century could not actually fully escape the frameworks imposed upon them by Orientalism itself. In part, we can say this was natural because it was such a dominant narrative and it was difficult for these intellectuals of the Orient to come up with a new paradigm. We can even say or see this now, where a lot of Turkish intellectuals and politicians continue to reproduce these Orientalist frameworks while they actually put forward their anti-Western worldviews. So for me, I would argue that whether we really moved beyond colonialism in a supposedly post-colonial world is very much up for debate. I'll stop now and thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for your attention.
I think that's so interesting. I mean, of course, the opposite argument can be made, which is that Said's book is just a fantasy written by an exile in America who just makes up this so-called hegemony which doesn't really exist, and therefore you don't need it at all to talk about the work of these earlier people such as Aliye. You see what I mean? There's a problem of anachronism.
Would you like to stop sharing?
Oh, sorry, yes.
Thank you.
The problem of anachronism to take this rather odd book from the point of view of scholarship, which has admittedly become very popular. It's a very bad book from the scholarly point of view. As I say, just one man's fantasy, which is, I think, no relationship with reality at all. And then imposing it back to a 19th century writer. I'm using this as a, as an example, as a counterexample. So I would have thought that it could all be turned completely upside down. And you could say, well, this is a fantastically interesting person in 19th century Istanbul. Let's begin from her writings and just see where it takes us, rather than this simplifying framework, which I've always, and over the years, become ever more skeptical about. I honestly think it's sort of a little bit like Karl Marx. It's a way to suppress the intellectual thought of the people. I mean, Orientalism. It forms the same place in Western scholarship as religion played in Karl Marx's analysis. You see what I mean? Tell people it's about Orientalism and that's it. It's all finished. You don't have to do any more thinking, really. To give you a little example, have you seen the work of Ömer Bakker? I've not actually met them personally, but I think they're an academic nod to. But he wrote a very, very beautiful article showing that you could actually piece together the historical development of Topkapi for almost every year of its existence, simply by piling up all the travel literature by Western scholars together. So obviously he ignored something. I haven't, because I've never met him, I haven't had a chance to ask what he said about Said. But anyway, he didn't take any notice of Said. He just piled it all up in a big pile. So there are obviously dozens and dozens and dozens of these books. Put them all in chronological order, their account. And then he simply distilled what they said about Topkapi from them. And he wrote the most beautiful essay on how Topkapi developed over a period of 200 years. It's a marvelous piece of scholarship. So that's the sort of thing which I think can be done when one doesn't allow oneself to be diverted by ideology and politics, but actually tries to do something scholarly. That's I think that's the sort of approach one should take. I think be a bit more skeptical about this rather odd exile in America. Yeah, I mean, one could talk about this about this a lot. I mean, what do you think about that counter argument? How would you approach it?
I don't agree with it, to be honest. I appreciate Said, I appreciate his arguments, a bit all his I mean, you can't take it wholesale, obviously. There are like counter arguments or weaknesses that need to be pointed out. And but you cannot also dismiss him out of hand. I don't think you can do that. And I think his framework, with all, as I said, with all his weaknesses and stuff, offers a good framework or good tool of analysis to look at this time period. I mean, you cannot understand this time period, obviously, I mean, from our point of view, without taking the idea of colonialism. Again, I want to use that word, Orientalism. So,
but the Ottoman Empire was never colonized. Of course, it was almost defeated, but not quite.
There were parts of it were, right? Like Egypt.
Oh yeah, it lost territories. It went
So in that sense, I mean, it doesn't have to be colonized like physically, but mentally, if you look at it, like
yeah, then we get into fantasy again. That's my point.
It's not. I don't think it's fantasy. I don't think you can dismiss it as fantasy out of hand. Like, I mean, Said's work influenced so much that.
Fine, that's what I'm saying. It's good ideology, it's good politics, but I'm saying it's not the same as scholarship.
No, I don't agree with you there. I think it's good scholarship. I mean,
Wow.
so yeah.
Can I ask, so are you saying the idea of exoticization of the other, are you saying that didn't really exist, or?
Oh, on the contrary, I think I think it exists all the time.
But
But not when you turn it into a kind of a dominant political argument with baddies and goodies. For me, it's also a bit like cops and robbers. You've got these terribly bad people, and you've got these terrible sort of good people, and these ones have been victimized. You see what I mean? I think it underestimates the dynamism of Turkey, and it also underestimates enormously the variety of what's been written about the Ottoman Empire at that time. See, there were literally thousands of books about the Ottoman Empire, absolutely thousands, and yet all really Said can do is take Delacroix and say, look, this is very nasty, fleshy things that look at all of these. Right, of course, it's ridiculous. That is also very to see. That's not the same. This is the point that I'm making. There are literally thousands of books written about the Ottoman Empire, many of which are just grindingly going through all sorts of different facts, really, about what the people saw, without going into this wide exoticization. So no mistake there. Of course, exoticization happens all the time. But I think that to move away from that basic point to putting into a framework, it becomes the all-encompassing way that you're supposed to understand this fantastically complex situation on the ground. I think that's the mistake. That's when it turns into bad scholarship.
and when you say start with her writings, so would you use a framework for that then?
I don't know, because I haven't read them. Which is my next question is, have you got any quotations from her writing directly that you can give us?
Not with me, no. Not with me, but
Right.
I mean, what do you mean? Like what kind of quotations do you?
Quotations from her work?
No, I don't have it with me there, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I see. Anyway, that's why I begin. and the other thing is, of course, is there's a lovely contrast here that's going on here. She's clearly resisting something. This is very clear.
Sorry?
She's clearly resisting against something in a very clear part of your excellent talk. So, what is it that she's resisting against then? How does she frame her own description of her resistance? Because she's aware that she's not conventional, isn't she? She's aware that she's doing something new.
Yeah.
So how does she express her self-determination?
She's saying it, that's it, like all these women come and talk to me about Islam and these like assumptions and these like arguments or whatever. But she says that's not true.
You haven't got any quotations from that either, not even from that one.
No, sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. I can't actually.
But
Sorry, hold on.
no. But I was actually, that's very important. But also, she had to resist her husband's initial ideas of where she should be in life. She had to resist her father's initial ideas of where she had to be in life. Does that kind of feature at all?
Sorry, say again.
She had to resist what her father says about her, being labelled as, do this. She had to resist her husband.
Yeah.
So does that idea of that she had to go through a process of self-emancipation, does that appear in her work, that side of it?
Yeah, I mean, you can see that in her novels. So which I didn't talk about here, which I read some of them, not all of them, but you can see that. You can see that like her characters are trying to stand on their own feet, and women characters especially, and that's why she made this like insistent reference to the women's need to financial independence so they can stand on their own feet.
Like an early Virginia Woolf. Could you talk a bit more about that? I mean,
so, for example, in one of her novels, there's this lady who basically earns her life through giving lessons, music lessons and stuff. So not to be dependent on her relatives or whatever, or her husband. As far as I know, sorry, I may be mistaken. But in that sense, so yeah, that's kind of like self-emancipation or self-realization of that. And I think she was a big advocate for that. Even though she was coming from like this huge wealthy family, Fatma herself, but she still within its limits, obviously. She's still advocated for women to be financially independent, basically. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But can you tell us the plot though? So the woman begins as a.
Sorry.
Oh, you don't remember the plot?
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah.
Did she go on and have children?
She did, I think, yeah. Yeah, she did. Yeah. I think, I'm not sure, but 2 maybe? Yeah.
Daughters?
I don't know. I remember, sorry.
Are there questions from our online audience? Go ahead, please. Oh, yes, indeed. I can see a hand up here. But my eyesight's not as it used to be. Is it Gemma?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's me. Hello,
Hello,
I'm
Gemma.
here.
Please, go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed that, and she's a very interesting figure who I didn't know about. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on where the relevance of what she advocates for in terms of women's rights, how her work is relevant and applicable to modern Turkey today in terms of women's position in Turkey.
That's a good question, actually. I think, well, I mean, Turkey has been governed by an Islamist government, right, for like the past 20 years, and there is this, in her work, there's this tendency, as I said, to bring together Islamic principles with advocating for women's rights. So in that sense, maybe her work may shed light on some of the possibilities for Muslim women in Turkey in today's world who kind of take like a distant approach to secular ways of life, but still want to maybe stand on their own. So in that sense, then like her works may give them an idea of how they could achieve their own independence or their own their own stance in the society without actually leaving or discarding their religion. So in that sense, maybe that's what Fatma Aliye can, quote unquote, I'm using this word, but I'm not like teach these Muslim women of Turkey today. I don't know if
you think they could maybe find some sort of inspiration in her work.
Yeah. I think that would be a good way to put it, actually. I mean, there are probably, I'm not an expert on like feminist history in Turkey, in the modern like Turkish Republic. There were probably people who tried to do the same thing that Fatma Aliye was trying to do and approach like women's rights through an Islamic reformist or Islamic perspective. I'm not, like as I said, I'm not an expert on that, but I think it's telling that she is like, her works are being published, her works are being like quote unquote translated into simplified Turkish so that more people read her. These are mostly her novels, though. I'm not talking about like the Nisvan Islam or Namdaran Zenan Islamiyan. But again, I mean, she can be a decent role model, right? Like almost like a grandmotherly figure.
I think it's very interesting that you talk about her works becoming accessible in modern Turkey. I mean, do we know of her, like the popularity of her novels? I mean, would most people maybe have read one or at the very least have heard her name? Would you think?
I would say heard her name, yes. I don't know how much they sell, but I mean, whenever I go to like bookstores or whatever in Turkey, I keep coming across some version of her works, right? More like it can range from like a very simplified Turkish to like these critical editions with like facsimiles of her work and stuff. So yeah. So, and I mean, I think it's quite symbolically significant that her face is also in like on the Turkish lira, 50 Turkish lira.
Yes.
And I mean, as I said, I can understand why she was not very popular with like the Kemalist regime, especially in the early Turkish Republic, and I can understand why she's making a comeback, right? With this government or this political environment. I mean, she's never going to be as popular as, I mean, some figures probably, but I think she deserves more recognition, and I think she's getting that recognition, to be honest. So, yeah.
That's great. So the next goal will be, you know, make her books taught in some curriculum somewhere. But
Maybe they are. I'm not. As I said, I'm not an expert. Maybe they are. I mean, maybe they are being taught in like Turkish literature courses in universities and stuff. I was mainly interested in her, as I said, from like an Orientalist perspective. Even
yeah, of
though
course.
even though David kind of disagrees with that, but yeah, I think that she actually speaks to that kind of literature as well, right? Like I think I mean her work is suitable for that kind of interpretation as well, to be honest. So yeah.
To answer your question directly, Gemma, yes, the ideas were very, very actively pursued already from the 1980s.
Okay.
So it's not new, but rather, of course, she's becoming more generally known to the public, and that's the way to understand it.
Thank you.
Definitely played a part in for example, in the Refah Party's arguments when they became prominent already in that period. Actually, Chidem would like to come in.
Yes.
Would you like to say something, Chidem?
Several things. I'm going to start from the end probably, because as Gemma talked and as the answers came in, my focus is shifting. First of all, I was in Anatolia. I won't tell you where I was. I was traveling in Anatolia, as I do these things, this summer. And I noticed that Fatma Aliye was the topic of online Quran courses and interpretation of Quran among the housewives. And it was used as some form of an apology and a warmed up romantic melancholy Islam, and how they can be Muslims, but at the same time modern, but the questions were not asked. And when I attended some of these in different places, these sessions, especially in one of them, when I started questioning her assumptions vis-a-vis the Quran. By the way, I have taught both the Quran and the Said for years. I'm retired now, but you know. Then I was met with very interesting sort of cornered replies. So yes, it is being taught and it is being pushed on to the popular, if you like, classes. Again, last night, I was discussing a subject with my colleague, Professor Colin Imber. You would know Colin Imber. I said, and Colin said something wonderful, which I think should be written in golden letters. He said, Quran, somebody said, what does Quran say on this? He says, it says whatever you want it to say. It doesn't say much. It is open to interpretation. It can mean this or it can mean that. It can mean anything you like. So I would also like to say that. Albert Said is fine, although there are problems with the examples he gives on and off. But I have always had difficulty in seeing how the others followed the Orientalist line. I think they were, the Ottomans intellectuals, they were just trying to defend themselves. And it was as if they had made a point of all the arguments they were getting from the other side, and they were trying to reply to those in most of the cases. And the case of Fatma Aliye strikes me as being one of those. She's trying to say, no, but we're really not that bad. And so I would take it as a defense rather than being accepting the Orientalist arguments, if you see what I mean. Thank you. I think I summarized it.
I
That's
mean,
it.
yeah, I mean, yes, exactly. She is saying, look, I mean, we are not as bad as you say we are, and she's doing that through an Islamic reforms perspective. She's defending Islam, or she's trying to defend Islam, or she's trying to defend the Islamic law, Islamic history, against these, as I said, against these portrayals by Europeans. So that's yeah, exactly. So in that sense, you're right. Thank you very much.
I actually think she's laid a great foundation for modern women in Turkey.
Yeah.
I've got some good Turkish friends who've been living there for so long, and I mean, the women have done so well in the society compared to where I'm from, Australia, where there's this glass ceiling, and you hit that ceiling and you don't go any further. In Turkey, they go high.
Okay. I mean, yeah, women movement, as again, I'm like going into a topic that I'm not an expert in, but the women's movement in Turkey, especially now, even in the recent years, is very strong. Very, very strong. They are always up, like, against the government or government policies. You see them, they are very determined. They don't back down from like police violence or whatever. I mean, I think with people like Fatma Aliye, though, they kind of got, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but they kind of got obscured by the more radical wing of feminist movement in Turkey, where they were advocating more of like a secular, from a secular perspective. So there were not many instances where until recently, as I said, where women's rights were defended through an Islamic perspective. So that was more relatively recent, I would say. I wouldn't say like very recent, but more relatively recent in comparison with the other wing of feminist movement. So.
Were there any particular women, Ottoman women, who were influential on it, and of the European women she was in correspondence with? Are there any names in particular that?
For like European women, for Ottoman women, I think I would say like she looked back to history again and then saw these examples, and she kind of interpreted those through a perspective of like women could actually do those things, like being poets in Islamic history, or like or being knowledgeable in like Islamic law, like Aisha did. So she kind of, I think she took inspiration from that. As far as like European women and stuff, I'm not sure, to be honest, sorry. She was in contact with, as I said, like she was well connected because she spoke French, and a lot of women came to Istanbul and she met with them. But if there was this like particular figure in European literature or European society, I'm not aware of, so I'm not sure. But then that may be, yeah.
And none of her letters survive in any other?
I think there are, yeah. I'm not, yeah.
Does she talk about these things in her letters?
I'm not an expert on Fatma Aliye, that's why, like,
Oh,
it's not my like main primary area of research, actually. My main primary area of research is late Ottoman Empire, late Ottoman Egypt. So this was more of like a side project for me. So that's why I took it on.
So you're
and-
suggesting avenues of research.
Yeah,
Which is absolutely fine.
exactly,
It's absolutely
exactly,
fine.
yeah.
So if anybody is out there and wants to look at these things, then I would suggest reading her letters, particularly if you can find obviously the ones in France, if she's writing for children, but
Yeah,
be absolutely fascinating.
I mean, there was a friend of mine was working on her, when
Right.
I was doing my PhD, but then she, I mean, for some reason or other, she quit. So that thesis was never written. It's out there. I mean, I would if I had the time and if I could, work on it.
But her letters would reveal so much about what she's
Yeah,
thinking.
yeah. But I mean, I have my own book project now to work on, so I can't do that. But maybe for a second project, if nothing is written on her. I mean, there's a substantial amount of literature on her, but nothing, as far as I know, in book form, in English. I mean, my advisor, Carter Finley, again, worked on him or her a lot, and actually, he was the one who brought Fatma Aliye to the English-speaking world's attention. But he never, again, found a chance to actually write a book on her. So it is out there, yeah. I mean, yeah, for anyone who wants to take it on.
Excellent question to ask, we understand. Did you want to ask anything?
No, I don't think so.
Any questions from our audience on that? Well, I think we just have to thank you for a remarkably stimulating.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Goodbye, everybody there. We'll
Thank
switch
you so
off the
much
Zoom
for
now, but
joining.
thank you very much for
Thank
coming.
you
See you
so much
again.
for joining. Thank you.
Bye.